Hey guys, it's Yuta. So the other day I showed you guys that kanji is not always easy to write for Japanese people, and many of you asked, why do Japanese people use kanji in the first place if it's so difficult? I'm going to answer that question. First, the basics. Japanese has 3 types of scripts: Hiragana, Katakana, and Kanji. Hiragana and Katakana are completely phonetic, well, almost, but this letter A is always pronounced as A no matter where it appears. For example, 食べ歩く、遊ぶ、夜明け. It's always A. This is very different from English A, which doesn't have one single sound. Father, angry, important, talk, debate. They are all different sounds. Hiragana and Katakana represent exactly the same set of sounds, and you can write every single Japanese word with either Hiragana or Katakana. But Katakana is mostly used to write foreign words like collection, collection, complete, complete. So why do we need both of them? Well, we don't exactly need them, but there are a bunch of reasons like historical reasons and other reasons, and I'm going to give you one very practical reason, which is readability. This sentence uses both Hiragana and Katakana, but it can be written entirely in Hiragana like this. But this is quite hard to read because Japanese doesn't have spaces between words, so it's very hard to distinguish words. But if you use Katakana, Katakana functions as a word divider. So let me use a different color for every other word. And as you can see, Katakana makes it easier to separate words. Now we can talk about kanji, and unlike Hiragana and Katakana, kanji is not phonetic as a single kanji can have multiple readings. Like this one. This one has more than 150 readings, such as sei, shou, ha, I, nama, jo, ki, yo, u, iku, iki, o, oki, and many more. So kanji are essentially symbols just like this one. Some people call it a number sign, some call it a pound sign, and other people may call it a hash. And how you read it depends on the context. For example, this is number 1, but this is hashtag Yuta is awesome. Well, I just made up that hashtag because nobody else did. Don't judge. Kanji is similar as it has different readings depending on the word. So, for example, 生活 and 生きる. And since a new concept often requires a new kanji, there are just so many of them and nobody really knows how many they are exactly. But at least we have tens of thousands. And we use all 3 types of scripts to write Japanese sentences. But why do we need kanji in the first place when we can just use Hiragana and Katakana to write everything? Again, there are a lot of historical and cultural reasons, but let me just give you 2 very important ones. Number 1, readability. Just like Katakana, kanji helps to separate words in a sentence. For instance, this sentence can be written entirely in Hiragana, but then again, it will be very hard to read it because it's not obvious at all how to separate words. So kanji can function as a word divider. Reason number 2, homophones and homographs. This is what makes kanji different from Katakana. I'll give you an example. As you can see, those words have the exact same spelling in Hiragana. So it's impossible to distinguish them by themselves. But if you write them in kanji, you will see that those are clearly different words. Now you might be wondering if we have a similar problem when we speak Japanese because you can't see the letters. Well, we kind of do, but it's much better because we have pitch accent. So you pronounce kansei and kansei differently even though you don't see that difference in Hiragana. And also if you are talking to somebody, you can always clarify, which is exactly what I did when she didn't understand what I meant by sento. Part of the reason why we have so many homophones is the large number of Chinese words in Japanese, because in the process of pronouncing Chinese words the Japanese way, a lot of sound differences were lost. Actually, the same thing happens with English words. For example, light and right both become laito in Japanese. So the word laito becomes a homophone even though the original words were different. But do we really need that many kanji? Can't we just use maybe a couple of hundreds? Well, we did try to reduce number of kanji, and we have a limited number of official kanji that are taught in school. Currently, we have 2,136 kanji on that list. Also, we used to have more complicated kanji, but we eventually stopped using them in favor of more simple ones. But 2,000 kanji is still quite a lot. Can't we just throw them away altogether? Well, actually, there has been a number of attempts to abolish kanji in Japanese history. Most of those people were Japanese themselves, but there was also an American general called John Pelzel from the Allied occupation of Japan, and he tried to completely romanize Japanese. His argument was that kanji would prevent Japanese people from becoming literate, and it will slow down the process of becoming a democratic country. To back up his reasoning, they conducted a massive national kanji test. But the results turned out to be surprisingly good. The average score was 78.3 out of 100. So they had to give up the idea of romanization. I have the impression that today, most Japanese people think the idea of abolishing kanji completely out of the question. I'll give you 3 arguments in favor of kanji. Number 1. Historical integrity. If we stop using kanji, the normal Japanese people won't be able to understand the vast number of documents available today in kanji. So there will be a huge cultural disconnect in Japanese history. Number 2. Semantic functions. We partially covered this already, but with kanji, it's often quite easy to guess the meaning of a word you don't know. Actually, you can do that in English. For example, this word, metaphysics, you can kind of guess what it means even though you don't know what exactly metaphysics is. But Japanese rely on kanji for that, so without kanji, it will be very hard to guess the meanings of new words. Number 3. Literary expressions. You can add different nuances to the text by using different scripts. For example, this is entirely written in Hiragana, and it sounds like it's written by a child. And if you write this entirely in Katakana, it will look like that it's written by a robot. And this poem uses Katakana along with the absence of kanji as a literary device. And it won't be the same if you just use the conventional style. So without kanji, this type of literary expression will lose much of its significance. So maybe it's quite impossible to abolish kanji? Well, that's not necessarily the case, because countries like South Korea, North Korea, Vietnam, they managed to stop using kanji for daily communication. And did you know that early video games in Japan didn't use kanji at all because of hardware limitations? And do you see what they did? They added extra spaces, and it's actually kind of readable. Come to think about it, our very first example. This sentence was actually quite readable even though it doesn't have any kanji, because katakana works as a word divider as we discussed. So let's do some experiment together. So we've got this properly written sentence, and we will write this in hiragana. This one's quite hard to read, but what if we use katakana in place of kanji? This is much more readable. Now let's add some spaces. well, kanji in katakana looks kind of weird, so let's just use alphabets. See, well, I find it surprisingly readable actually. Well, it's far from perfect, but not using kanji is not as inconvenient as many people might think. And who knows, maybe we will end up writing Japanese like this eventually and free ourselves from years of kanji education. And this makes me think, maybe the real reason of using kanji is something else. And in my opinion, the real reason is attachment. Japanese people are just deeply attached to kanji and the history and the culture that kanji is associated with. And if I tell you how I feel, well, I haven't always had a good relationship with kanji. But if people stopped using kanji, I think it will be quite sad. So I guess it's like an old marriage. Your partner is not perfect. You guys fight a lot, and you might occasionally forget her birthday. So it might be possible to find a new partner, who is more agreeable, healthier, or even younger. But you are sticking with her because you guys have gone through a lot. And your marriage kind of works. But above all, at the end of the day, you love her. I hope I answered your question. Hey guys, it's Yuta again. Well, if you want to learn Japanese, and especially the kind of Japanese that actual Japanese people use as opposed to the artificial textbook Japanese, you should click link and subscribe to my list, Japanese with Yuta. And also my channel is made possible by your support, so if you want to support me, you can go to my Patreon page. Alright, see you guys soon. Ciao ciao!